Matthew chapter 5, we look at tonight here. The power of living. I'm influenced by things I see. Very particularly by lives that are lived in front of me. The things that people do. I remember years ago, there was a movie called Billy Jack. This guy was the karate whatever back in that day and time, but he fought for the underdogs in this area. And after the movie had ended, everybody was walking out like, just they had this tone like, "Don't mess with me." It's like all of that focus of that movie just had all the men. Of course, the women were still walking out normal, but the guys were like, "Don't mess with me. I've got these hands that'll." It's just how people's lives influence us. Maybe you've seen movies, Rambo, Patriot, different things like that. And I get inspired by, the flag just racing through to get where it needs to be. And, you come out feeling good. And I take that, of course, usually, and focus it on what can we do at the church. Because that powerful living has a tremendous impact on us. So I want to talk about that because the type of lives that we live can be and ought to be very powerful in a good way. And so we'll look at some of those things. And in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus starts by talking about attitudes. It's described as the Beatitudes, but he talks about attitudes of poor in spirit and those who mourn and those who are meek, etc. And what he's talking about is what's inside a person. Because what's inside us is going to determine how we do what we do and who we are, and the powerful living that we ought to have only comes when it comes from within. Now Jesus looked around and he saw enough of the hypocrisy among not all the religious leaders, but enough of them that in Matthew 23 he took the Pharisees to task and he ripped them down because they didn't do what they ought to do. Powerful living was gone. They were ghosts inside, and yet they required everybody to do all these rituals, and it didn't mean anything. It was empty living, not powerful living. So he deals with this in the beginning, and then he starts talking about this type of living that makes a difference in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. You're the salt of the earth. Now Jesus is going to start with the negative side, because there are bad influences. So after he says the salt of the earth, he says, but if the salt loses its flavor, how can it be seasoned again? And then he uses a term that my grandpa used to use. It's no longer good for nothing. Grandpa always talked about people that are good for nothing. And he didn't talk about it too much, but he had a lot of good things to say about people. But if Grandpa talked about that person's a good for nothing, they were a good for nothing. And it's exactly what Jesus is saying here. As a Christian, they ought to have such an example, and if they don't have it, as far as God's concerned, it's a good for nothing. It tears down. So, this morning we, matter of fact, in our lesson, talked about a guy named Saul, Old Testament. In 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 13, after Saul had been king, it looks like a year or two. It mentions 1 year, and then it talks about 2 years. And he goes out, and he's supposed to be conquering these lands and winning over the Philistines, and he was supposed to wait, if you remember, we talked about it some this morning, supposed to wait until Samuel came back to offer this sacrifice. That was the right thing to do in order to have a victory. It's just the pattern that God set up. And he couldn't wait on Samuel. And for that one action of going ahead and doing the sacrifice himself, just minutes early, Samuel was right there as the sacrifice had ended, just minutes early, but he did it himself. Later on, you go through the pages, he lost his kingdom. And I think, oh God, really, you're being kind of tough on one action of one man. He was trying his best. His men were running off and hiding in rocks and holes in the ground and caves, and some swimming across the river and they're getting away. It's like he was desperate. But he was also king. And everybody looks at the king. The king was chosen to be the leader of God's people, not just the king of the land. And the king was chosen because he was head and shoulders above everybody else, but he was to be that way spiritually too. And for a person to be that way spiritually, and to turn around and do what Saul did. I say Samuel, Saul, what I'm talking about here. What King Saul did was not good. He was not fit to be the leader that God needed him to be. And in that case, he was good for nothing. And so eventually God took the kingdom away. And it was bit by bit, but Saul knew it was going to happen. He knew it was going to happen soon. God couldn't use him anymore because his negative example. There's a couple characters that are mentioned, also some special people of God. Leviticus chapter 10. They are sons of the high priest. Now, they're not little toddlers, 10 and 11 years old, that are running around the church building. These are grown men that are sons of the high priest, who themselves are high priest. Now, they're younger than their dad, obviously, but they're high priest. And they are on the duty at the temple, and they're to go in and offer the sacrifices. And so as the stuff is being set up, all these sacrificial things, the laws that God has set up in Leviticus chapters 8 and 9, you're seeing them going through all these specific details, and they're weird. But every time they did these things, there's a little phrase that we kind of capture at the very end of these little sections that say, and they did just as the Lord commanded. Now, they knew they were doing just as the Lord commanded. But God was highlighting to those who would read later on, this is what makes a powerful example. This is what I want, to do what I commanded. So they were doing this all the way through chapters 8 and 9, all these details. And it comes to chapter 10, and then it says, now Nadab and Abihu went out to offer incense. And some translations say strange fire. I think more accurately it says unauthorized. It was a fire that God said nothing about. It wasn't that it was a fire that God said, don't do this, but God said, this is the fire you use. And one match is as good as the other. They got the fire from over here instead of over there, and that was all it took. And God struck them down. That was so quick, and I remember reading that years ago for the first time, and reread and think, boy, that was a tough circumstance. But that was so crucial for their example that God wouldn't even allow the dad, that's Aaron now, Moses' brother, wouldn't allow him to mourn over the situation. Don't even rent your clothes. Don't do that. No sackcloth and ashes. Don't even mourn over it, because I'm to be honored as holy. That example as a leader of God's people. And so as we're looking around, we can see, not just in the Old Testament, the New Testament too, there are occasions that God will highlight individuals that don't do things just right. It's not that, we're ready to get struck down by a lightning bolt if we mess up, and we know we haven't. We're kind of looking around, maybe wondering, will it happen? But it's rather put in here in black and white for us to understand how powerful that example is. And in these situations, we're starting with the negative side. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There's a man who's living with his father's wife. And as Paul is writing this section here in this letter here, he talks about, and you're proud of him. So the influence was beginning to permeate the church. He was worried about the example so much that he uses a term that's really rather strong. And he says this, he says, deliver such a one to Satan. Does that mean, you're going to throw him out there in the fire? No, but basically he's chosen that track. Cut him off. Now, later on, he'll explain the purpose of that was to win him back. But at that point, just that little detail, because that example was so powerful in the church, as guys sometimes are, we're talking adults now here, the rest of them are bragging on him. Hey, what a man. We've grown up. Teenagers and college guys bragging on things. And so God said, not in my church. Wrong example. Because it's so powerful. Now, our example can be good too. So we started where Jesus did. We talk about the salt that's not working right. Being good for nothing. We said, verse 14, he'll turn it around and talk about light, salt, light, either one. But they have that influence. You're the light of the world, verse 14. A city that's set on a hill can't be hidden. Now, there's two things to think about here. Number one, the idea of the light and the permeating and the purity and all that, and what an impact that it makes. Confession time. I love sunlight. I don't like the rain. I'm happy for the rain to fall down on my yard. Wish it would come at night all the time so the grass would grow just right, because I'm not always out there to water it like it should. It's John Creasy, sorry, but the grass is dying.
Oh, amen.
Put it out, did everything I'm supposed to do, but, John's out there working his jobs and all this, and here's the preacher just making a mess of things. But nonetheless, that's grass. But good examples and light just kind of go hand in hand. It just makes a difference in our lives. The sunlight just enriches us. It revives us. It makes us think good. We look at the clouds and the blue sky and all that, and we feel better. And God says, I want your influence to make people liven up. And I don't mean get enthusiastic, excited, and bubbling over and all that, but to be different. To make an impact like light does in dark areas. Well, that's the thing, If you're working at night on something and you've got one of those lights that comes around your head, little headlights. You've seen some of those? Girls probably not, but the guys, I'm talking about. And it's so neat to have both your hands free to be able to do something because you got light. God says, I want you to be out there in that dark world and be light. You'll make a difference, a powerful impact. A lot of Old Testament examples, and one of them was read tonight about Moses here at the beginning of services. And those young men are doing a great job. They are powerful examples. They do a good job reading, and I can see the improvement. Boy, I rehearsed it this morning. I could tell. Tam was up there just putting emphasis in it. I thought, you're going after it. And after I told him, I said, you practiced that, didn't you? He goes, I did. I said, I could tell. He goes, good. He's making an impact and challenging us. Good impacts. And so those examples, like we read from Hebrews 11, God's putting them out there. See, these are the people there. This is what we ought to be like. And so he lines them up there in Hebrews 11 so we can say, these are things that ought to charge us and challenge us. Yes, it was by faith they did those things, and that's the emphasis. But when you get down to chapter 12, it talks about those people are our cloud of witnesses, and they're surrounding us, and now let's go after it. See, it's there to show us the example so we can be powerful examples ourselves. John 13, verse 15, Jesus talks about example. He says, I've given you an example. Do as I've done. And then Paul will talk in Acts chapter 20, verse 35, in all things I've given you an example. And that word example is used quite often. Sometimes older translation uses the word ensample. It's like getting a sampling of it. Like going to these grocery stores and they have these little samples you can, or Baskin Robbins, and you keep trying flavors. After you get to about 23, they want to quit. They don't let you just keep sampling. But we like to get samples of good things. God says our Christian life, when people taste it, they go, oh, that's good. That ought to make a difference, an impact. And so this is what God is after in demonstrating how powerful that can be. Now the last part, here's what we're talking about, this light of the world. A city set on a hill can't be hidden. Just can't be. It's, if you've got trees like in Tennessee, you can kind of dig them back and hide one or two houses, but you've got a whole city up there, and they've got power on at night, you're going to see it. You're just going to see the light. And so God is telling us something here. Your choice, good or bad, but you're out there. Everybody sees your example. They know who you are. They know your behavior. Back up, a week or two ago, I was at the house. It was on Wednesday night. I'd gone home from the office to do something, met Melanie there, and I was talking to one of the neighbors, and the girl across the street was talking, and she said, well, I know you've got to go, she says, because you go to church every Wednesday night. I never announced that. She doesn't have a church bulletin, but she goes on Wednesday night because I'm always going on Wednesday night. I go to church on Wednesday night. And I thought, that's cool. And see, they know you. They see that example. Now, that's not the only thing, but they know church is important to you. God is important. They see your behavior. They see who you are and how you are. Makes a difference. Verse 15, nor did they light a lamp and they put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, that it gives light into all the house. And then the challenge in verse 16, let your light shine, that they may see your good works and glorify the Father. Not that they brag on you, but they go, boy, that's a church they go to. God must be alive there. Something's happening there. There's a difference. And they give God the glory. They may not know him like we know him, but there's a difference because of the powerful living. And as much as I try to really put together sermons and think of new things and look for applications and try to time things with certain relevancy and how things can fit and all kinds of things happening in society and all, those lessons can't be nearly as powerful as you're living. Just can't be. Even the best of the preachers can't live as powerful a sermon as you preach with your living. It just says so much more than words can ever tell. The actions, the difference. It was back a few weeks ago that I alluded to an illustration, and I want to come back and read this again because it not only talks about example, influence, but it talks on a long-range thing. See, sometimes we think our example stops with the kids that see us in the auditorium, or maybe our neighborhood, or our friends who we work with, or go to school with, whoever, and it pretty much stops there. But I don't think so. I don't think so at all. This is an article I pulled out years ago and had it stashed away and found it again just a couple days ago. It says, the U.S. standard, the railroad gauge, the distance between the rails, is exactly 4 feet 8.5 inches. And the guy writes, that's an extremely odd number. Why is that gauge used? Because that's the way they built them in England. And the English expatriates built the U.S. railroads when they came over. Well, why did the English people build them like that, 4 feet 8.5 inches? Because the first rail lines were built by the same people who built the pre-railroad tramways. And that's the gauge they used. Why did they use that gauge? Because the people before them who built the tramways used the same jigs and the same tools that were used for building the wagon wheels before that time. And that was the wagon wheel spacing. Okay, then why did the wagons have that particularly odd spacing between their wheels? Well, if they tried to use any other spacing, the wagon wheels would break on some of the old long-distance roads in England, and because that was the line spacing that was set in the wheel ruts. So who built the ruts in the roads? Imperial Rome built the first long-distance roads in Europe and in England for their legions. And the roads have been that way ever since. And the ruts in the roads? From the Roman war chariots who formed the initial ruts, in which everyone else had to match for fear of destroying their wagon wheels. And since the chariots were made for Imperial Rome, they were all exactly the same in their spacing. So the United States Railroad gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches is derived from the original specifications of Imperial Roman war chariots, and then he adds, and the bureaucracies live forever. Kind of funny, but the fact is that is a long-lasting impact. 2,000 years ago, when they were building these things and extending these things, they had no idea of a railroad system or a United States. And yet the impact continues living on. So next time you drive over the railroad tracks, think of the power of the example. Now here's an extra twist in this whole thing. When you see a space shuttle sitting on a launch pad, there are two big booster rockets attached to the sides for the main fuel tank. They are solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. The SRBs are made by, whatever term here, Thucoil, if I pronounce it right, at a factory in Utah. The engineers who designed the SRBs would have preferred to make them a bit fatter, but the SRBs had to be shipped by train from the factory to the launch site. The railroad line from the factory happens to run through a tunnel in the mountains, and the SRBs had to fit through that tunnel. The tunnel is slightly wider than the railroad track, and the railroad track, as you know, was designed by the Roman chariots 2,000 years ago. So why do our engineers have to deal with that size SRVs? Because the guys were building Roman chariots 2,000 years ago. Impact. And sometimes we think, oh, well, if I just, nobody paid any attention, but it has this ripple effect. It goes on longer than when we throw a rock in a river or a pond or whatever, and it ripples and eventually dies out. It can keep on going and keep on going. We have no idea of how much impact we make. So here's the exhortation from Jesus. Let your light shine. Don't let the salt be a poor savor. Let it be good. Let it be quality. Make a difference. Sometimes we don't know, we don't see the differences we're making. They're all kind of hidden and subtle out there, but the rest of the people are taking note. And you're preaching a more powerful impact, obviously to 1,000 more than to come here, than I could ever do in so much better way. And I mean that. So do it right, and do it well, and honor God. And that's what we're about as Christians. Close the lesson tonight just with that thought. If there's someone here that's not right, your light's not shining the way it should be. It's more like the salt. The thing is, you can change that. And God wants it to be changed. And we can make a difference. And we should. So if your life isn't right, or you're not a Christian, choose that tonight while we stand and sing.